The entire world is holding its breath right now. A war that was supposed to last a day or two has now spiraled into something far bigger, far darker, and far more dangerous than anyone officially admits. What started as an American and Israeli military operation against Iran has now become a fire that is consuming the entire Middle East, creeping toward NATO borders and knocking on the doorstep of South Asia. And the most frightening part is not the missiles or the drones or the bombs. The most frightening part is that not everything you're being told about this war is the truth. Let us take a moment to understand how we got here. Trump launched this war with confidence, with bravado, with the belief that Iran would fold within 48 hours. The plan was simple on paper. Strike hard, strike fast, eliminate the leadership, and watch the regime collapse. The United States and Israel together assassinated Ayatollah Khamenei. They eliminated more than 40 top Iranian leaders in a series of coordinated strikes. On paper, that should have broken Iran. In reality, it did not. Iran did not collapse. Iran did not surrender. Iran did not bow down. And that is precisely what has enraged both Washington and Tel Aviv, to the point where we are now seeing something that can only be described as collective punishment. Tehran is being carpet bombed, not targeted strikes, not precision attacks, carpet bombing of a capital city with more than 10 million people. This is not a military strategy. This is rage. This is what happens when a superpower realizes that its plan has failed and it does not know what to do next. More than 1,000 lives have already been lost in Iran. And these are the official numbers, which means the real numbers are likely far higher. When you hear governments quote casualty figures during active conflicts, you must always understand that the truth is buried somewhere beneath those numbers. Meanwhile, on the Israeli side, the reported death toll stands at around 10 people. Think about that for a moment. More than 1,000 Iranians dead, 10 Israelis dead. This is not a war between equals. This is not a balanced conflict. This is something else entirely. This is a superpower and its regional ally unleashing their full military force on a country that, despite everything, refuses to surrender. And Iran's refusal to surrender is perhaps the most significant political and military story of this entire war. Iran knows it cannot win this war in a conventional sense. It knows it cannot match America's air power, America's naval superiority, America's technological edge. So Iran is not trying to win. Iran is trying to make sure that America does not win either. This strategy has a name. It is called asymmetric warfare. And it is extraordinarily effective when executed with patience and discipline. Iran's goal is not to defeat the United States on a battlefield. Iran's goal is to bleed the United States slowly and steadily until the financial, political, and human cost of this war becomes unbearable for the American public and the American government. Iran wants to break the backbone of America and its allies through prolonged, sustained, low-cost harassment on multiple fronts simultaneously. One of the most critical fronts in this asymmetric campaign is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage, barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, is the throat through which 20% of the world's entire oil and LNG supply flows every single day. Tankers carrying millions of barrels of oil pass through here constantly, and Iran does not need to sink every tanker. Iran does not need to attack every ship. All Iran needs to do is create enough fear, enough uncertainty, enough risk that the global insurance industry walks away, and that is exactly what has happened. Insurance companies are now refusing to cover ships that sail through the Strait of Hormuz. They are telling ship owners, if your vessel enters those waters, you are on your own. If it sinks, you bear the loss. We will not cover it. And so ships are simply not going. The strait is effectively being choked not by mines or missiles, but by spreadsheets and actuarial tables. Trump is desperately urging shipping companies to keep moving, promising American military protection, promising government insurance guarantees. But promises made in the middle of a war by a president whose credibility is under siege carry very little weight in the boardrooms of global insurance firms. Meanwhile, Iran has been scoring specific and significant military victories that the American media has largely downplayed. In Qatar, Iranian forces successfully destroyed the AN/FPS-132 ballistic missile early warning radar. This was not some minor piece of equipment. This radar was worth approximately $1 billion. It had a scanning range of 1,000 kilometers. It was the nervous system of America's entire missile defense architecture in the Gulf. It tracked incoming ballistic missiles, gave early warning, coordinated intercept responses. Without it, America's ability to defend its Gulf assets and those of its allies is fundamentally compromised. Satellite imagery confirmed the destruction of this radar. It was a direct hit. And then in Bahrain, Iran destroyed 2 SATCOM terminals at the United States Navy Fleet headquarters. These are not symbolic strikes. These are carefully chosen, strategically devastating attacks designed to degrade America's command, control, and communication infrastructure across the entire region. The United States has pushed back, claiming that Iran's missile launch rate has fallen by 86% since the beginning of the conflict. American officials are presenting this as evidence that Iran's capabilities are being degraded, that the strikes on Iran's missile launchers are working, that there is, as they put it, a ray of hope. But there is another explanation for why Iran's launch rate has slowed down, and it is far more concerning. Iran may be deliberately conserving its arsenal. Iran may be choosing to draw out this conflict over months rather than weeks, keeping its powder dry, maintaining strategic ambiguity, forcing America and Israel to stay mobilized at enormous expense, while Iran husbands its resources for the long game. Every day this war continues, costs the United States at least $1 billion, according to the Pentagon's own figures. Iran knows this. Iran is counting on this. And then there are the drones. The story of Iranian drones in this conflict is almost impossible to overstate. More than 1,000 drones have been fired toward the UAE alone. And here is the admission that should terrify every military planner in Washington. American officials have gone to Congress and told elected representatives directly, we cannot intercept all of these drones. We do not have enough missiles. We do not have enough interceptors. The economics of this problem are brutal. An Iranian Shahed drone costs a few $1,000s to manufacture and a few $100s to operate. An American interceptor missile costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. To shoot down one cheap drone, you must fire an expensive missile. Do that 1,000 times, and the math becomes catastrophic. Iran understands this perfectly. It is essentially forcing America to bankrupt itself defending against attacks that cost almost nothing to launch. But now we must talk about something that goes even deeper than the battlefield, something that is shaking the foundations of the entire global narrative around this war, because it is becoming increasingly clear that not all the attacks being attributed to Iran in this conflict actually came from Iran. And if that is true, then the question of who is actually engineering this war and toward what ultimate end becomes the most important question in the world right now. Let us start with Cyprus. The United Kingdom has a major military airbase on the island of Cyprus. When a drone struck that base, the initial radar signature suggested Iranian origin. The story was immediately deployed across Western media. Iran attacked a British military base. Britain, which had been trying to stay out of this war, which had explicitly said it did not want its bases and resources used in operations against Iran, suddenly found itself in the crosshairs. And predictably, after the attack on British soil and a British military installation, London began shifting its position. France and Germany watched what happened to Britain, and also began moving toward America's position in this war. The attack on Cyprus achieved something diplomatically that no amount of American lobbying had managed to achieve. It brought European powers into alignment against Iran. And then the UK confirmed it. The drone that struck the Cyprus airbase did not come from Iran. The radar signature matched Iranian drone characteristics, but the weapon itself did not originate from Iranian territory or Iranian forces. Around the same time, the massive Saudi Aramco facility was targeted. Aramco is the single largest oil company in the world. An attack on its infrastructure sends shockwaves through global energy markets. The attack was immediately attributed to Iran. And then, quietly, it emerged that Iran had no involvement in that attack either. No evidence connected it to Iranian military operations. Now, when you line these incidents up alongside each other, when you look at the pattern, a very disturbing picture begins to emerge. Attacks that benefit no one more than Israel. Attacks designed to drag unwilling countries into war against Iran. Attacks calibrated to maximum diplomatic effect. Attacks that happen to come with radar signatures and styling that mimics Iranian weapons, but cannot actually be traced back to Iran. This is the architecture of a false flag operation. And the world has seen this architecture before. The history of false flag operations is long and documented. In 1939, Nazi Germany staged the Gleiwitz incident. German operatives dressed in Polish uniforms attacked a German radio station on the Polish border, left behind a dead concentration camp prisoner as supposed evidence of Polish aggression, and used the incident as the justification for invading Poland. World War II began within days. In 1931, the Japanese military detonated an explosion on a railway line in Manchuria, blamed it on Chinese saboteurs, and used it as the pretext to invade and occupy Manchuria. The explosion was so weak it did not even damage the railway track, but that did not matter. The story was what mattered. The justification was what mattered. But perhaps the most relevant historical example for what we are discussing today is the Lavon Affair of 1954. This was not a theory. This was not a conspiracy. This was a documented, confirmed Israeli intelligence operation that was eventually exposed and acknowledged. In 1954, Israeli military intelligence recruited Egyptian Jews, Jewish people living in Egypt, and tasked them with a specific mission. They were told to bomb American and British cultural institutions in Cairo and Alexandria. Libraries, cinemas, cultural centers owned and operated by Americans and British. The plan was that these bombings would be attributed to Egyptian Muslim extremists. Britain, fearing violence against its interests, would then refuse to withdraw its troops from the Suez Canal zone. Israel would benefit from continued British military presence in the region as a buffer. The operation was discovered. The agents were caught. Israeli Defense Minister Pinhas Lavon was forced to resign in disgrace. It was a scandal of the highest order, and yet, decades later, the Israeli government officially honored the surviving agents of this operation. It gave them certificates of appreciation. It praised them. The shame was never internalized. The lesson was never learned. Or perhaps the lesson that was learned was simply to be more careful not to get caught next time. There's also the matter of the King David Hotel bombing, carried out by Jewish paramilitary forces in 1946, killing 91 people, including British, Arab, and Jewish victims, and the Baghdad synagogue bombings of the early 1950s, where bombs were thrown at Jewish targets in Iraq to encourage Jewish immigration to Israel, with evidence pointing toward Israeli-connected operatives. These are not ancient legends. These are documented historical events that can be researched and verified. But of all the historical examples, perhaps none is more damning than the attack on the USS Liberty. In June 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israeli military forces attacked a United States Navy intelligence ship called the USS Liberty. The attack was sustained and deliberate. Israeli aircraft and torpedo boats struck the ship repeatedly over the course of more than 2 hours. 34 American servicemen were killed. More than 170 were wounded. Israel claimed it was a terrible mistake. They said they thought it was an Egyptian vessel. But declassified National Security Agency documents tell a completely different story. The NSA's own internal reports concluded that Israel knew it was attacking an American ship. The reason was straightforward and chilling. The Liberty was an intelligence-gathering vessel. It was listening. It was watching. Israel did not want the United States monitoring its military operations during the Six-Day War. And beyond that, there is evidence that the goal was to sink the ship entirely, blame Egypt for the attack, and drag the United States into the war against Egypt on Israel's side. The plan failed only because the Liberty did not sink, and survivors were able to tell what happened. The United States government, under Lyndon Johnson, chose to suppress the truth and protect the alliance. But the documents exist. The evidence exists. History knows what happened. Now, against this historical backdrop, let us return to the present war. This conflict did not begin spontaneously. When hostilities broke out, the United States and Iran were actually engaged in negotiations. A deal was on the table. There were serious diplomatic conversations happening. And then Israel attacked Iran. And the United States, which had been conducting those very negotiations, found itself dragged into the war anyway. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, let slip in a recorded statement that America had essentially been pulled into a war it was not fully prepared for and had not fully chosen. The implications of that admission are staggering. The foreign policy of the world's most powerful nation was, in that moment, being driven not by American interests, but by Israeli decisions. This raises a question that is now being openly debated inside the United States, not just among ordinary citizens, but inside Congress and in the courts. Is Israel driving American foreign policy? The war's stated objectives have shifted so dramatically and so rapidly that the incoherence itself tells a story. On the first day, the mission was to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. On the second day, it was regime change, removing the Islamic government from power. On the third day, the objective became destroying Iran's ballistic missile arsenal. On the fourth day, the goal expanded to eliminating groups like Houthis and Hamas and bringing regional stability. And then Trump's close ally, Senator Lindsey Graham, announced that, actually, this is a religious war. A religious war. Stop and absorb that statement. An American senator, close to the president, describing an American military conflict in the Middle East as a religious war, and Pete Hegseth, the head of the Department of Defense, the man overseeing the actual bombing of Iran, had previously spoken on record about American support for building a third temple in Jerusalem. These are not fringe voices. These are the people making decisions. The context of the Third Temple is critical to understanding the deeper architecture of what is unfolding. Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem is the third holiest site in Islam, sacred to more than 1.5 billion Muslims worldwide. For Jewish religious nationalists and Zionists, the same site is known as Temple Mount, and it holds enormous theological significance. Jewish tradition holds that 2 temples once stood on this spot and were destroyed. The goal of rebuilding a third temple has been a driving force in religious Zionist politics for decades. It has influenced Israeli domestic policy, settlement expansion, and the broader project of establishing complete Israeli control over Jerusalem and ultimately the entire region. If you understand this goal, then the war against Iran begins to make a different kind of sense. Iran is not merely a military adversary. Iran is the last significant regional power capable of challenging Israeli dominance in the Middle East. Egypt has been managed. Jordan is in a peace agreement. Syria has been devastated. Iraq has been weakened. Saudi Arabia has been cautiously moving toward normalization. But Iran remains. And as long as Iran remains strong, the project of complete Israeli regional dominance cannot be achieved. And if that dominance cannot be achieved, the political conditions for demolishing Al-Aqsa and building a third temple cannot be created. This is the endgame that some analysts believe is driving the entire strategic logic of this war. Iran's new supreme leadership situation adds another layer of complexity. Reports suggest that Mojtaba Khamenei, the second son of the assassinated Ayatollah, may be named as the new supreme leader. If this is confirmed, it changes the entire calculus around any potential negotiated settlement. A son avenging his father's assassination does not make compromises easily. A new leader who comes to power in the middle of a war, whose first act of governance is navigating a conflict in which his father was murdered by the enemy, carries a personal and political burden that makes peace negotiations extraordinarily difficult. Israel likely understands this. Israel may be counting on it. In America itself, the political pressure on Trump is mounting. The Senate voted on a war powers resolution that would have required Trump to seek congressional approval before taking further military action against Iran. The resolution failed, 53 to 47, a narrow margin. But the fact that 47 senators voted for it tells you something significant about the direction of political winds in Washington. CNN polling shows that a majority of ordinary Americans do not support this war. They do not understand its objectives. They do not see what it has to do with American national interests. The Pentagon is spending at least $1 billion every single day. American missile defense systems are being stripped from allied countries and concentrated around Israel to protect it. Spain said simply that it would not allow its bases to be used in operations against Iran, and Trump publicly threatened Spain for that statement. What does it mean when America threatens a NATO ally for not participating in a war? What does it mean when American foreign policy is so clearly being driven by one country's interests that even traditional allies are refusing to go along? And then there's India. This war has now touched India's strategic neighborhood in ways that cannot be ignored. The Iranian warship Iris Dana came to Visakhapatnam at India's invitation to participate in an international fleet review. It was not a combat vessel on a war mission. It was a warship on a diplomatic and ceremonial visit. After the fleet review, it was sailing back home, and the United States Navy torpedoed and sank it near Sri Lanka. This is the first time since World War II that an American submarine has sunk an enemy warship in combat. Around 30 sailors were rescued by the Sri Lankan Navy, but more than 100 sailors were left to die. 80 deaths have been confirmed. America celebrated this as a victory. America left more than 100 human beings to drown in the Indian Ocean and called it a success. Compare this to Nazi Germany, which, as horrifying as it was in every other respect, at least rescued sailors from ships it sank before taking them prisoner. America, in 2026, left men to perish in the sea and declared it a great achievement. This should shock every nation with a naval tradition. This should shock every country that believes in the basic laws of war and the fundamental obligations of humanity toward combatants who are no longer fighting. But more immediately for India, this raises a direct and urgent question about sovereignty and security in India's own maritime backyard. America conducted a combat operation, sinking a warship in the Indian Ocean near Sri Lanka, without notifying India, without consulting India, without asking India's permission. India invited that ship. India had a relationship with those sailors. India was directly implicated by this action, whether it wanted to be or not. And what happens when America decides that Indian ports should be open to American warships? What happens when America decides that Indian air bases should be used for operations in the Middle East? Spain was threatened for saying no. What will India do if the same pressure comes to Delhi? The people in India who are cheering what is happening to Iran, who see the destruction of a Muslim country as something to celebrate, need to stop and think carefully. The same force that is carpet bombing Tehran today, that is leaving sailors to die in the Indian Ocean, that is threatening Spain for exercising its sovereignty, that is bypassing international law as if it does not exist, that force does not stop at Iran. Bullying does not retire after one target. A world where one nation can destroy any country that refuses to comply with its demands is a world where India too is ultimately vulnerable. The rules that are being broken today to punish Iran are the same rules that would protect India tomorrow. Their destruction is not a victory for anyone except those who want a world where might alone determines right. The war that was supposed to end in 2 days has lasted more than a week and shows no signs of ending. Iran is not defeated. Iran has a new leadership in place. Iran's drone campaign is costing America far more than Iran itself is losing. The Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed to normal shipping. Oil prices are climbing. Insurance markets are in chaos. European allies are uncomfortable. American public opinion is turning. The Senate almost passed a resolution reining in presidential war powers. And somewhere in the shadows of all of this, questions are mounting about who is really orchestrating the escalation, Who was staging attacks on British bases and Saudi oil facilities? Who was working to pull in every possible country against Iran? Who benefits most from this war dragging on and expanding? And who has a documented history of doing exactly that kind of thing? These are not idle questions. These are the most important questions of our time. The answers will determine the shape of the world for decades to come. The answers will determine whether international law survives as a meaningful concept or becomes entirely hollow. The answers will determine whether nations like India retain genuine sovereignty or slowly surrender it under the press of an unchallenged unipolar hegemon. And the answers will determine whether the fires currently consuming the Middle East eventually cool and fade or continue spreading until they reach all of us, wherever we are, whatever we thought kept us safe. No one in this war is being fully honest with the world. The war objectives keep changing because there never was a clear, legitimate objective to begin with. The casualties are being undercounted because governments always undercount their own failures. The false flags are being exposed slowly because truth always moves more slowly than propaganda. And the human cost, the 100 sailors drowning in the Indian Ocean, the 1,000 dead in Tehran, the families sheltering from bombs in a city that was not a military target, those costs are being quietly set aside so that the powerful can pursue their strategic objectives without the inconvenience of conscience. This war will not end quickly, and when it does end, whenever that day comes, the world that emerges from it will be different from the world that went into it. The only question is whether that difference will be navigated with some semblance of wisdom, some recognition of the lessons of history, some acknowledgement that the tactics of false flags and manufactured pretexts and contempt for international law ultimately destroy not just their targets, but the moral authority of those who use them. Or whether we will simply repeat everything that came before, again and again, until there is nothing left to bomb and nothing left to lose. The world is watching, and the world is waiting. And in the meantime, the fires keep burning.